The village of Longoni slept in the embrace of swaying palms and the whisper of winds brushing against the dry savanna. At its heart stood the humble Holy Light Church, its wooden doors weathered and creaking under years of devotion. By day, the church rang with the melodies of worshippers, but by night, its shadows stretched long and ominous under the pale moonlight. Within those walls, Pastor Gideon Bill knelt before the pulpit, his face buried in trembling hands. The congregation had dwindled to barely a dozen souls, and the offering box sat nearly empty. His prayers, once fervent and full of hope, now felt hollow. "Lord, have you abandoned me?" he whispered, his voice cracking. Gideon had given his life to the ministry at a young age. He was a man of faith, or so he believed. Yet as the years passed, his faith became a brittle thing, worn down by poverty and the constant comparison to city pastors who lived like kings. He thought of Pastor Ezekiel, his childhood friend who now commanded a sprawling megachurch in Nairobi. The last time they had spoken, Ezekiel had hinted at a special way to grow his ministry. Gideon dismissed it then, but now, his desperation began to cloud his judgment. 3 months later, Gideon stood in his sparse office, staring at a gold-embossed invitation from Ezekiel. The letter was short and cryptic: "Come to the city. There is more to serving God than you know." Gideon's wife, Martha, found him with the letter in hand. "You're leaving for Nairobi?" she asked, her tone laced with worry. "I need to know what Ezekiel is offering," Gideon replied. "If it can save our church, I must try." Martha hesitated but nodded. She knew the burden her husband carried, though she had her own doubts about Ezekiel's newfound success. The city was a roaring ocean of lights and chaos, a stark contrast to Longoni's serene simplicity. Gideon felt out of place in his faded suit and scuffed shoes, but Ezekiel welcomed him warmly into his grand home. The mansion exuded opulence, with its marble floors and golden chandeliers. "Gideon," Ezekiel boomed, embracing him. "You finally came." The two sat in a lavish study where Ezekiel poured them glasses of fine wine. "How's the ministry?" Ezekiel asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "It's struggling," Gideon admitted. "I've prayed, fasted, done everything I can, but nothing changes." "How did you transform your church?" Ezekiel leaned back and smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There's a higher power, Gideon. Beyond what they teach us in theology. It's not about prayer, it's about tapping into the real source of influence." "What do you mean?" "I'll show you," Ezekiel said, standing. "But you must promise to keep an open mind." That night, Gideon found himself in a remote part of the city, standing before an ancient stone structure hidden among towering trees. The air was thick with an unsettling energy. Inside, the chamber was dimly lit by torches. Hooded figures stood in a circle, their chants resonating with a rhythm that seemed to vibrate in Gideon's chest. At the center of the room lay a stone altar, inscribed with symbols that glowed faintly. "This is the Brotherhood of Eclipsed Suns," Ezekiel whispered. "A fraternity of power and enlightenment." Gideon felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do they do?" "They unlock your potential," Ezekiel said. "But it requires a commitment, a pact." As the ceremony began, Gideon watched in horror and fascination. One by one, the hooded figures placed their hands on a central flame, and their bodies seemed to glow with an eerie light. When it was Gideon's turn, he hesitated, but Ezekiel's voice urged him on. "Do this, and your ministry will never lack again." With trembling hands, Gideon touched the flame. Pain shot through his body, but with it came a surge of power, unlike anything he had ever felt. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he saw flashes of his future, a packed church, overflowing offering boxes, and people praising his name. The days following the initiation felt like a dream. Gideon returned to Longoni with an unshakable confidence. He noticed subtle changes in himself, his voice carried a new authority, and his touch seemed to linger in people's minds. During his first sermon after the ritual, the church was fuller than it had been in years. His words flowed effortlessly, weaving through the hearts of his listeners like a spell. When he invited them forward for prayer, he felt an undeniable energy transfer with each hand he laid on their heads. By the end of the month, the church was bursting at the seams. Gideon's fame spread across neighboring villages, drawing people desperate for healing, success, and miracles. But for every miracle claimed, there was a price paid elsewhere, though only a few began to notice. Amina, a local seamstress, was one of Gideon's most loyal congregants. She credited her booming business to his prayers, but soon after he laid hands on her for a special blessing, her life began to unravel. Her sewing machine broke down inexplicably. Clients stopped coming. Worst of all, she felt an unshakable heaviness, as though her very spirit was being drained. "What's happening to me?" she asked her friend Kwame, who had his own suspicions about Gideon. "There's something wrong with that church," Kwame said. "We need answers." Meanwhile, as the days turned into weeks, Gideon reveled in his newfound power. Each service grew larger, and his reputation as a miracle worker spread like wildfire. People flocked to him, desperate for breakthroughs. Gideon's prayers seemed to unlock doors for some, but not without consequences. A young farmer, Juma, came seeking prayers for his barren land. After Gideon laid hands on him, Juma's crops flourished almost overnight, but his wife fell gravely ill, her vibrant spirit replaced by a listless void. At first, Gideon ignored these signs. He justified the misfortunes as mere coincidence, convincing himself that his work was of God. The Brotherhood had warned him not to question the balance of energy. Every gift comes with a cost, Ezekiel had told him. Gideon chose to focus on the rewards. The church in Longoni transformed almost unrecognizably. Gideon replaced the old wooden benches with sleek chairs imported from the city. A new sound system boomed during services, and a gleaming white tent extended the church's capacity. But the changes were not just physical. Gideon himself was different. His sermons, once rooted in humility, now carried undertones of arrogance. His once pure intentions grew corrupted as he began to see his congregation not as souls to be saved but as sources of power. He introduced a new practice, the divine touch. After every sermon, he invited individuals to the altar for personal prayers. It was during these moments that he harvested their destinies. Amina sat at her workbench, staring at the half-finished dress before her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the fabric, but she couldn't bring herself to sew. It had been weeks since she felt inspired, and her once thriving business was now on the brink of collapse. Her dreams had grown darker, filled with unsettling images of shadowy hands reaching for her. The same hands that Gideon had placed on her head during his blessing. Unable to ignore her instincts, she visited Mama Noki, an elderly woman known for her spiritual insight. "Child," Mama Noki said after listening to Amina's story, "what you are describing is the work of a shadow manipulator. Someone who steals life and light from others to fuel their own power." Amina's breath caught. "You mean Pastor Gideon?" Mama Noki nodded grimly. "It is not the pastor you once knew. He has made a pact with darkness." Amina began to notice patterns among Gideon's congregation. Those who received his blessings often prospered for a short while before suffering inexplicable losses. One man who claimed to have been healed of blindness was later found wandering the streets, confused and muttering to himself. A wealthy merchant, after donating heavily to the church, declared bankruptcy within months. Driven by a need for answers, Amina approached Kwame. Together, they started gathering testimonies from other victims. What they uncovered was chilling, a pattern of shattered lives that all pointed back to Gideon's touch. Gideon's success came at a cost to his own soul. Nightmares plagued his sleep, vivid visions of faceless figures crying out for justice. He began seeing fleeting shadows during his sermons, whispering his name. One night, Ezekiel visited him unexpectedly. "You've been careless," Ezekiel warned. "The Brotherhood is watching." "What do you mean?" Gideon asked, his voice trembling. "The balance must be maintained," Ezekiel said. "You've taken too much without giving back. If you don't offer a sacrifice, the power will turn on you." "A sacrifice?" Gideon's stomach churned. "A life," Ezekiel said coldly. "It's the only way to solidify your position." Meanwhile, Amina and Kwame took their findings to Mama Noki. The old woman devised a plan to expose Gideon during his most public moment, a Sunday service. You cannot fight him with ordinary means, Mama Noki warned. He is protected by forces beyond your understanding. But with the right ritual, we can reveal his true nature to everyone. Amina gathered a small group of victims willing to confront Gideon. Armed with their testimonies and Mama Noki's spiritual guidance, they prepared for the showdown. It was a service unlike any other. The tent was packed with people, the air thick with anticipation. Gideon stood at the pulpit, his voice booming with confidence. But as he began the divine touch session, Amina stood and raised her voice. "Stop!" she cried. The congregation turned to her in shock. "Pastor Gideon is not what he seems," Amina shouted. "He has stolen our destinies, our lives." The air grew heavy as Mama spread through the crowd. Gideon froze, his eyes narrowing at Amina. "You dare accuse a servant of God," he bellowed. Before he could continue, Mama Noki entered the tent, her presence commanding silence. She carried a small calabash filled with herbs and ash. "Let the truth be known," she declared, sprinkling the ash across the altar. The air shimmered, and suddenly, Gideon's figure began to distort. Dark tendrils of energy rose from his body, visible to everyone. Gasps filled the tent as the congregation saw the shadowy forms of those he had stolen from clinging to him. Gideon collapsed to his knees, his facade shattered. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he whispered, but the brotherhood wasn't done with him. A deafening roar filled the tent as shadowy figures materialized, their wrath directed at Gideon. Mama Noki and the other spiritual elders walked quickly, forming a protective circle around the congregation. Through chants and prayers, they banished the brotherhood's presence, but the cost was great. Gideon was left broken, his power stripped and his soul scarred. He confessed everything to the congregation, begging for forgiveness. The church was cleansed, but the scars of his betrayal lingered. In the months that followed, the church slowly rebuilt itself under new leadership. Amina's business began to recover, and the lives of other victims improved. Gideon disappeared from the village, choosing a life of solitude in the wilderness. Rumors spread of a man who wandered the savannah, preaching repentance and seeking redemption for his sins.